You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 18th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 1 a.m. in Beijing, 2000 in Beirut, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. This time it's walkie-talkies. Another wave of explosions strikes Lebanon. Are India and China really willing to agree where their borders are? And a British train finds an exciting new reason for cancellation. Squirrels. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel Hilton and Vincent McAvenny will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical series will reflect on the perils of imperial hubris. Not that we expect anyone to take the hint. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and by Vincent McAvenny, journalist and Monocle Radio regular politics commentator. Hello to you both.
Hello.
We will have more from you both shortly, but first to Lebanon, where there has been another wave of detonations in personal communications devices. Yesterday, at least 12 people were killed and perhaps as many as 3,000 injured by exploding pagers carried by members of Hezbollah. Today, 9 more people are reported dead and 300 injured by what appears to be exploding walkie-talkies. I'm joined with the latest on this by Nicholas Noe, co-founder of the Beirut-based MideastWire.com. Nicholas, we spoke to you earlier this morning on the briefing about, your process of understanding what had happened yesterday. Whereabouts are you today? What, as far as you can tell, is going on?
Well, it looks like the original reports that were coming out in the early morning that the Israelis detonated these pagers yesterday because of concerns that Hezbollah was discovering the tampering. It seems as if they decided today to go with a larger set of explosions, which seem also to have been of a higher magnitude as well for other devices. And just to be clear, it's not just walkie-talkies. In the last 2 hours or so, we have video footage and journalists reporting also solar heating devices as well, which are on many homes and in many homes across Lebanon, given the lack of electricity there and the financial crisis of the last 4 years. Also, with some of these devices, including walkie-talkies and pagers and solar panels now, it's not 100% accurate for us to say that these are all devices or technology that were distributed to Hezbollah members or were necessarily in their hands. It seems that there have been at least several children and a number of civilians killed and wounded who were either in possession of these devices or near them, wherever they may have been. So it's a much more complicated portrait, let's say. But this is the second wave. It is definitely having, I think, let's say, maximizing the psychological effect of yesterday's strike. But again, we still have a very limited tactical maneuver by the Israelis. Yes, it's the largest intelligence penetration for Hezbollah that they've seen in their existence. But it still appears from the public reporting that the actual number of people and actual number of Hezbollah members and then actual fighters is relatively limited. That doesn't mean it's not a huge impact on the organization. It is. And the head of the party will have to, and he's going to address it in a speech tomorrow at 5 o'clock Beirut time. And I think everyone's going to be watching that intensely to see how he treats this huge intelligence failure on their part.
Hezbollah did say yesterday that there would be some measure of retaliation for this, but is it clear how possible that's going to be if they can't communicate with each other, I guess, unless they return to extremely manual means of doing it?
Well, the first thing is that none of us are military experts, right, or communications experts.
True enough.
Right. So one thing, the second thing is that at least from the public reporting, one shouldn't exaggerate that suddenly all of Hezbollah's communications have been severed or all of their backup communications have been severed. I think that's highly unlikely from what we're seeing. Hezbollah also famously has wired communication networks, which were the source of a mini civil war in 2008. Now, whether the Israelis have gotten into that or not is another consideration. But right now, one thinks it's very likely that Hezbollah still has effective command and communication modalities, although very likely they are questioning all of those, and very likely they're spending substantial time, manpower time, to sweep those devices and networks.
How do people in Lebanon seem to be reacting today? Is it different from yesterday now that it's clear that this wasn't a one-off?
This is always a really tough thing to say about general mood in the country, et cetera, after these sort of successive disasters happen. All I would say is that Lebanese as a people, as I know them as a foreigner and a guest in the country for 20 years, that they are tired overwhelmingly. They are under enormous strain of a country that has collapsed under the worst economic meltdown basically in modern history, and just a whole series of disasters. So, this second wave, I think, caught a lot of people, let's say, not expecting it. And by the way, it certainly may not be over. There is an ongoing war between Hezbollah in particular and Israel that has not just been going on since October 8th, when Hezbollah decided to get involved in the conflict on the side of Gaza and on the side of Hamas specifically, but this war has been going on between these two sides since Hezbollah's inception during the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. That's when they were born. So this is not a one-off, and people are, I think, unfortunately, very used to it in some ways and maybe inoculated in a lot of ways, sadly.
You correctly point out that this is a conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, which has been going on for some time. It is extraordinary, though, that Hezbollah, it's easy to forget, are not, in fact, the government of Lebanon. Have we heard anything from the government of Lebanon since things began exploding yesterday?
Yes, but first thing to say is that Lebanon technically doesn't have a government. It has no president. It has an acting prime minister, an acting cabinet. It has a barely functioning parliament whose mandate has serious questions. Yes, there's no government spokesperson, really. So, yes, the different aspects of the Lebanese government have been engaged in this crisis. I'd say most notably the Minister of Health, Firas Abiad, who is one of the really admired people in Lebanon. They have been performing a heroic responsibility and work during the cascading attacks, let's say, which has really overwhelmed a lot of the health system there. The acting Prime Minister Meati, of course, has even attended condolences for a Hezbollah MP whose son was killed by one of the pager explosions. But this is an extremely fragmented, fractured government entity. Ministries don't really function. They haven't really functioned since the country basically financially collapsed 4 years ago. So there's very little actual state infrastructure. The army itself is mainly hobbling along with, donations from the United States and the government of Qatar.
Nicholas Noe with MideastWire.com. Thank you for joining us for the second time today. Let's bring in our panel, Isabel Hilton and Vincent McAvenny. Vincent, this time yesterday, I guess this looked like some bizarre one-off. Would it be premature to start assessing it as a bizarre two-off, or might there be yet more where this came from?
I think yet more. This has shown incredible imagination as well as technical skill from Israel, likely from Mossad. They have not only penetrated, it seems, the pager network, but also walkie-talkies and, as we just heard there, solar powers and solar panels. And when you look at the scale of solar panels in that country, just looking at the figures, I mean, they are a sort of primary means of energy and heating. And if you've got one on your roof right now, you'd be pretty terrified. And I think this is having, beyond, these might have been small explosions, and thankfully they might not have, killed that many people, but they have obviously injured many, many people. They they could potentially, the psychological effect on this is massive. If you think that your sort of neighbour can do this to you, to reach in, this has obviously taken months, if not years, of careful planning, of this sort of slowly creeping in and all through the country. And the idea that they could reach in and do this to you, there are questions about the timing as to why now, if it had been discovered, and so they had to sort of literally pull the pin on this. But it is remarkable.
To say the very least. Isabel, a thought from you on this as well. I mean, I think it's very, very plausible that one of the things that Israel is hoping this effect will have, and I think we're safe in assuming who is behind this, in much the same way that they have had the same hope about a much less subtle campaign that they have waged in Gaza, is that this will turn the local people not so much against Israel, but against Israel's targets. That just as I think there is a hope among Israel that at some point, though there's precious little indication of it yet, the people of Gaza might come to blame Hamas for the catastrophe that has rained down upon them. That perhaps, is there any hope here that the Lebanese people will start to resent Hezbollah for bringing this upon them on top of, well, as Nicholas very capably delineated, their myriad other problems?
Well, I think that's a fairly forlorn hope. I think it's perfectly acceptable that to imagine that they are fed up of conflict and would like their country to be put back together again. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to guess who they might blame for this. I mean, this is a terrorist attack, as many have pointed out, and many, serious politicians have pointed out that you do not attack indiscriminately a population with no guarantee that civilians won't be hurt, and many civilians have been hurt. So I'm not sure that this is, yes, all right, Hezbollah may be blamed for bringing it upon them, but I don't think that the agency is going to be confused. That this is a deliberate act by Israel, and it's an indiscriminate act by Israel, as many of the acts in Gaza are.
I mean, Israel, just to follow that up, Isabel, would argue, if and when they actually acknowledge that they were behind this, that it was an extremely discriminate attack in that they were targeting the personal devices of particular people who had them on their person.
Yes, but other people have clearly been hurt, including children.
Indeed so.
So you can't guarantee that.
Absolutely, you cannot. We doubtless will have much more on this across all our news shows tomorrow, beginning with The Globalist. But to India now, where folk concerned about its border disputes are usually concerned, and in fairness, not without reason, with India's border disputes with Pakistan. However, India's border disputes with China are at least as hair-raising. Within the last few years, there have been several dust-ups involving the troops of the two enormous nuclear-armed superpowers, some causing fatalities. However, there now, at the risk of tempting fate, etc., appear some grounds for optimism following a meeting at the BRICS summit in St. Petersburg between India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Both sides have emitted ameliorative noises. And go me for getting the word ameliorative out with all the syllables in the right order on the first go. Isabel, has there been, do we think, some kind of breakthrough? Are there outstretched hands across the disputed border?
There's certainly been a cooling off of hostilities. I mean, a few weeks back, the Chinese appeared to be drawing back from troops that they had put right on the border, and indeed troops and personnel who were across the border and occupying villages in technically what was not Chinese territory. I mean, there was a fair. It couldn't really get very much worse than honouring the man who led the Chinese troops in the last very bloody confrontation in 2020, when a large number of Indian soldiers were killed. That man was honoured with a flag-bearing role in the Beijing Winter Olympics. So, it was pretty hostile. That was the time when India started restricting Chinese investment and indeed banned several hundred Chinese apps entirely from India, including TikTok. So, we have warmed up since then. And why have we warmed up? Well, it's partly that both sides need each other rather more than they have acknowledged previously. So India is looking for Chinese investment. India is looking to develop its high-tech sector. It's taken over some high-tech manufacturing which has been displaced from China. It's now making iPhones. And indeed, there are Chinese companies who are investing quite heavily in the Indian tech sector. So it needs assistance to make the kind of leap that China has made. And that has softened some of the hostility towards China. China, at the same time, could do with not having a border dispute with India at a time when it may be contemplating hostilities elsewhere. So there may well be an element in this of trying to neutralise a big Asian power that is straddling the fence on whether it's siding with India or China, because at the same time as warming up slightly with China, of course, India is also in a kind of semi-military association with the United States. So it's doing what India does. It's trying not to get totally committed to either side, but it makes a lot of sense for China to try to neutralise the possibility of hostility from India when, it's got a lot on its plate elsewhere.
Just to follow that up, though, Isabel, if we look at one of the disputed territories in particular, what I'm trying to get a handle on is how serious China is about this stuff, really. So where Arunachal Pradesh, for example, is concerned, that disputed bit at the far northeast of India, I should know where it is, I went there once, extraordinary place. How, on a scale of 0 to Taiwan, how serious is China really about Arunachal Pradesh?
Well, Arunachal is quite a large territory, and India also, of course, has an equivalent large territory. So if they ever got around to settling the McMahon line, they could do a swap. But I think that mainly what it is the capacity to put pressure on India and annoy India. I mean, remember that China and Pakistan have an extremely close relationship. And one of the functions that China performs for Pakistan is keeping a lot of Indian troops tied down who would otherwise, be looking at Pakistan. So, that's the kind of one of those strategic functions that China isn't likely to give up. But there is a difference. What China has been doing in the last few years is creeping across these borders, moving people in, establishing villages, building roads, building access to a border for military deployments. And that's a sign that, watch it, India, because we can win this fight if you choose to have it. How much it really wants the territory. It's not territory that it talks about very much. China has a number of, if you like, lost territories that it doesn't go on about. It goes on about Taiwan. Funnily enough, it doesn't go on about Manchuria, which the Soviet Union seized at the end of World War II. And it doesn't really go on about India unless there's a clash.
Vincent, all that taken in, is there, as a general rule, not specifically necessarily applying to India and China, is one of the reasons that disputes like this don't get solved that it can actually be useful for them to be unsolved to parties on each side of the border?
Oh, absolutely. Any time an Argentinian politician is in trouble, where do they cite? Las Malvinas, the Falkland Islands. A land dispute has the sort of added edge as well of stirring up national feelings, of stirring up feelings of pride in your nation and wanting to see it as a powerful player on the world stage. And that's something that Argentinian leaders have often sort of reached for at times of trouble. And when I was in Argentina talking to them, talking to foreign office workers about how they found working there and things, and we got to this discussion, they sort of said, well, you've got to remember this is sort of the only major conflict they've been in living memory. So for a lot of people, it's something that they know well, and that they, it's like Britain with the Second World War. It's part of the national story, and that's why they kind of reach to it. So these kind of disputes, they rattle on, and they're very helpful distractions for leaders in peril.
Well, let's move along to somewhere closer to home, and the optics are arguably suboptimal. A recently elected centre-leftish British Prime Minister making cheerful common cause with an Italian counterpart of the far right. Sir Keir Starmer has nevertheless been consulting with Giorgia Meloni about possible means of deterring the migrant boats which continue to cross the English Channel. 23 more have come ashore in the last 4 days, carrying 1,188 people. 8 others died on Sunday when one boat boat capsized. Italy has, among other measures, paid Tunisia and Libya to do more to interdict migrant craft and sent some asylum seekers to have their claims processed in Albania. Vincent, first of all, before we get into the policy, on this or any other front, should Starmer care about what this looks like when he's standing next to the duly elected Prime Minister of a European ally?
No, I don't think he should. And I think there's a double standard in operation here, because for years we saw Conservative Prime Ministers, standing next to Giorgia Meloni and other world leaders. This is part of the deal. If you're the leader of this country, you have to go to these bilaterals with leaders that you might not be on the exact same page with, of opposing political philosophies, and try and work together. You have to go to G20s and other meetings like UNGA and pal around with these people as well. And so I don't think Starmer is too worried about it. It's also been, it has to be said, an incredibly busy news week when it looks at the grid. These images have not really cut through, given everything that's going on this week. So I don't think Starmer is too worried. And we saw back in the major years, he at times was close to Berlusconi, and that didn't really do him too harm. I think people generally accept that this happens. It's part of the job. I think people were a bit more put off by Rishi Sunak, who, as I recall earlier this year, sort of jetted off specifically to a right-wing conference that Meloni was organising. I think even Steve Bannon might have been talking at that conference, and he did that on his own time in the weekend, and that was a little bit more jarring. But this is quite clearly an official governmental visit.
Isabel, Starmer, seeking as ever to portray himself as the arch non-ideological pragmatist, is stressing that as far as he's concerned, it is just about what works. Italy is claiming a 64% drop in the number of Mediterranean crossings this year. So is there an argument that Italy has figured out what works?
Italy has, in one sense, figured out what works. I think the problem is not that Starmer is meeting Meloni. The problem is the interest that he is taking in Meloni's methodology, because Meloni is a problematic figure. She has, slapped down the court. She has interfered in challenges to this policy. And cutting the arrivals has been achieved by doing a deal with countries from which these migrants were coming to stop them leaving. Now, I'm not sure that that's a terribly good look for a man who is a lawyer and who, has campaigned on a greater justice all-round platform in the UK. So I think he's looking a bit trapped by fear of the right in Britain, by the fact that this remains a toxic issue, by the fact that the worry that Farage and the Tory party can always get him on this, and that there will be Labour Party members and Labour Party supporters who are worried about it. But I think it's problematic, frankly.
And Vincent, is it, do you think, in Britain now as toxic an issue as it was before the election? Because the great irony of the situation before the election was that the Tories who were in government were making ceaseless noises about stopping the boats must be stopped, while demonstrating repeatedly that they were completely incapable of actually doing it.
Yeah, I mean, they burnt through Home Secretaries who were pledging that repeatedly, and nothing happened. The numbers have only grown in recent years from, a few hundred some 7 years ago to now sort of tens of thousands. We're at about the 50,000 mark a year. And in terms of what they're doing, I think a lot of people were very uncomfortable with the Conservatives' Rwanda plan. We now know that hundreds of millions was wasted on that only 4 people in the end who volunteered to go went. And what Sir Keir Starmer is doing, as well as looking at this sort of upstreaming, as what it's described as, what Italy's been doing, paying off North African countries to try and contain people, that's something that the UK has been doing for many years now in France, and it doesn't seem to be really stopping. What the UK would most like to do is deploy our own police forces onto those French beaches, but France has categorically always said that is not going to happen, but you can give us the resources and we'll stop it. But this sort of interest that he's expressed in their Albania plan is interesting, because I wonder if this distinction would sit more comfortably with more people in Britain, because a lot of people were uncomfortable with Rwanda. Part of that scheme was that people would be taken to Rwanda and they would be processed there. But if their asylum claim was successful, they would stay in Rwanda. They wouldn't then be transferred back to the UK. What the Albanian plan is, as Italy's seeing it, is they're sort of offshored for processing to Albania. If they are successful, then they will be brought to Italy. So the UK already has a deal with Albania, a send-back deal. Anyone coming from Albania claiming asylum is pretty much automatically sent back to Albania. It's deemed a safe country. So there is already a kind of close cooperation between the two governments. You could see the packaging of this being very different from Rwanda in that there's a backlog in the country. Huge parts of the aid budget in the UK right now are actually being used domestically to pay for people in hotels, which is a problem because there's a backlog of claims. So you could see, if Labour messages this right, more people being on board with this idea that it's a transfer to Albania, which might dissuade some, but then that's to assess properly who should come here, and then we have the time to bring people in as we're clearing that backlog slowly and try and set them up in lives here.
There is, however, the fact that Starmer has also said that there will be no change in safe and legal routes to the UK. And the last Tory government closed down pretty much all the safe and legal routes, which is one reason why so many people are trying to cross the channel in boats. And I don't see very much difference to promising to process people in a third country or opening up safe and legal routes. So you process people, British officials process people. If they have a legal claim, they come. If they don't, they don't. The problem with this system is it has been so thoroughly broken. So no safe and legal routes outside the UK and very little processing in the UK. Hence, a lot of people, staying in hotels at the taxpayer's expense. So if you were to start by fixing the system, which they've also, at least in the UK end, promised to do, you might find that this problem becomes a lot clearer because at the moment we have a huge muddle between people who are on those boats who could be, people from Afghanistan who have a perfectly valid claim and people who don't. And that confusion makes this a permanently toxic problem.
Completely. And let's not forget for Labour, I mean, the number two party in vast numbers of constituencies behind Labour and the Conservatives was, of course, reform. They know that is biting into their base vote, what was in 2019 dubbed the Red Wall. And they are worried about this. 5 years isn't actually that long a time to get things done by the time the next election comes around. And I think when you talk to Labour people, their priority is delivering. They're not so worried about optics because they think when you actually deliver, which is what the last government got wrong, people will be pleased for the results. And come 5 years' time, for certain things like turning around, cutting waiting times on the NHS, reducing the flow of migrants and getting rid of this bill for the hotels for people that are waiting to be processed, it's that having those results in a few years' time will help them. But, it is an incredibly complex problem. No one should think it's not. And we also have to say part of this is, this is going to be a century of migration. Climate change, as well as sort of wars and everything else, is going to drive more and more people. And it's just going to be something that we're going to have to all get a lot more used to.
Well, a big hello now to any listeners tuning into the Daily by way of passing the time before boarding the rescheduled flight onto which they were shunted because their train to Gatwick Airport was delayed by squirrels. A pair of the fluffy-tailed nutscoffers boarded a service from Reading to Gatwick and refused to disembark, displaying the passive-aggressive obduracy which may be familiar to people who have ever attempted to shoo the little bastards out of their strawberry patch. The service was terminated at Red Hill. First of all, have either of you ever seen a squirrel on a train?
No.
No. Vincent?
No, I've seen a passenger get on with a parrot that proceeded to say hello to everyone in the carriage as he walked to his seat. The parrot, not the passenger.
The parrot have a ticket?
Yeah,
I don't know. It was heading to Bristol. The West Country is wild, so maybe it had flown over the barrier.
Either the parrot or the passenger saying hello to everybody is incredibly irritating. Where are we on squirrels generally? Are we fans?
We like the red ones, not so keen on the grey ones.
Really? I mean, I do have, as the introduction there intimated, quite a lot of them in my garden, the grey squirrels, that is, and for all the fact that they do destroy the strawberry patch and have stripped my apple trees almost entirely, God, that's making me sound like I live on a grand estate with an orchard. To be clear, listeners, I do not live on a grand estate with an orchard. I just have a couple of apple trees in the garden. I actually quite like them, though, Vincent. Where are you on squirrels?
Yeah, I'm a fan. I mean, we're going to talk, internal city wildlife, anything but foxes, really, and the horrible noises that they make.
See, I like foxes as well.
Really?
They do make odd noises.
I mean, make a racket.
The noises of them having sex are horrendous. That is something.
Whereas squirrels have sex really quite quietly.
Yes.
I'm to the best of my recollection, I've never heard so. Well, perhaps
you will have done. You will. It's the weirdest noise ever. You're going to YouTube it now and sort of realise what foxes sound like.
I'm absolutely not going to do that. No, I was talking about the squirrels, but of course the reason I don't know what they sound like when they're doing that, Isabel, is that they might just be very quiet. Have you at least, come on, help us out here, have you had any sort of transport service delayed by the intervention of wildlife?
No, I have been subject to many transport delays, but not. In fact, the worst one was a train in India, you won't be surprised to hear, which was meant to be a 5-hour journey, and it was 23 hours late. But they didn't actually mention wildlife at all.
Vincent?
I mean, it's nebulous, but I was once driving a golf cart on a course in South Carolina.
Now who's got a posh estate with a, exactly.
When an alligator got out of the sort of water feature and just parked itself over the path that I was driving along. So that was something I had to...
Okay, that's when I say that's pretty cool. Obviously, there is a ceiling on how cool any story set on a golf course can be.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do you do? Do you swerve around the alligator? Do you just back up?
You back up a bit, wait and see what it does, and then you sort of go as wide as you can around it.
Well, if we're not talking trains, I did have a car journey somewhat delayed by the necessity to stop and deal with a rattlesnake in Florida.
Oh, in the car?
It was on the track, and the driver decided he had to attend to it. So down he got, brave man.
I have been in a car held up by emus on the subject of animals which are famous for their passive-aggressive bastardry. It was a very narrow track in the bush, and there was a bunch of them, and they just stood there. And as my increasingly irate father discovered at the time, if a bunch of emus have decided they're just going to stand there, then they're just going to stand there.
Have you ever met a flock of sheep?
Well, there is that as well. I have, now that I think of it, also been delayed by sheep in both France and Syria. But the one I would like to bring to the table, it was not a wildlife intervention, but a picturesque attempt to forestall it. Prior to takeoff from a remote airport in Iceland in a very small aircraft, they deputised local children to run down the runway brandishing umbrellas at puffins and seagulls, which gather on the runway. And of course, as the pilot explained, what you don't want is them panicking when the plane takes off and ending up flying through a whole bunch of them. I was very, very glad when that plane landed at the other end, I can tell you. Just before we go, can we all at least agree that somebody from Great Western Railways should be sacked, possibly even arrested, about the statement they issued, which said the squirrels had, and I quote you, were breaching bylaws, as in he's doing a riff on bylaws there, and referred to it being a nutty tale.
Yes. I'm only glad. I hope that man didn't have access to the intercom on the trains. That's a major hazard.
Anything's better than see it, say it, sorted, isn't it?
No,
really?
you absolutely know that this is one of those people who think access to a railway train intercom makes them a personality. And also it's that thing, and train companies are especially bad for this, the corporation that wants to be your friend. Just like, get the squirrels off the train and get me to the airport. Vincent McAvenny and Isabel Hilton, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical series reflects on one empire which learnt the hard way and another which didn't learn at all. Many beards have been ponderously scratched these last 2.5 years by pundits pontificating upon the mysteries of the Russian soul, with specific reference to an apparently limitless capacity for suffering, often self-inflicted, and punishment, occasionally arguably provoked. To be clear, beard scratching is deployed here metaphorically and literally, there being no reason at all why women and or people unable or unwilling to grow beards generally should be excluded from ruminating gravely upon the masochistic proclivities of the Russian psyche. Anyway, by the end of this day in 1812, and yes, that does predate the formation of the Red Army, never mind its choir, by a little over a century, and yes, we know there actually are famous pieces of music inspired by the events we are shortly to discuss. We're getting to those. Moscow lay in ruins, destroyed by fire. The blazes had begun a few days previously. Such an immolation had assumed a doleful aura of inevitability a few days before that. On September 7th, 1812, at Borodino, about 120 kilometres from Moscow, the Imperial Russian Army had capitulated to France's Grand Army, after a hideous grapple occasioning tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Russian Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov sounded the retreat. Napoleon was on the march. The French Emperor may have had some inkling that he was striding, if not exactly into a trap, then possibly not towards exactly the prize he coveted. Victory at Borodino had come at dreadful cost, perhaps a third of his troops dead or wounded. Those remaining were exhausted, ill, and at the very far end of a very long supply line. The first snows of winter were a few weeks away if they were lucky. And when the Grand Army trudged into Moscow, they found it all but abandoned. Armand de Caulaincourt, the veteran diplomat who had tried to talk Napoleon out of the Russian adventure but gone along for the ride anyway, chronicled the general bewilderment.
Moscow was a deserted city where one came across none but a few wretches of the lowest class. The emperor's face, normally so impassive, showed instantly and unmissable the mark of his bitter disappointment.
Nevertheless, by September 15th, Napoleon had taken up residence in the Kremlin. He had little time to unpack. The first whiffs of smoke were creeping through the windows. Moscow was beginning to burn. At which point, cue Prokofiev from War and Peace, the opera of Tolstoy's book. Napoleon prudently relocated to Petrovsky Palace, but his troops were powerless against the firestorm. By the end of this day, 212 years ago, there was not a lot of Moscow left, as Alexander Pushkin would gloat a couple of decades later.
Napoleon waited on Moscow's submission, crawling to him on her knees, to offer up the Kremlin keys. But there was no capitulation. My Moscow chose not to bow. No gift, no feast she gave him now. Only a mighty conflagration.
This is the version of events that has entered Russian mythology, that the city was torched in a magnificent act of self-sacrifice. It might have been that. Certainly Moscow's Governor-General, Fyodor Rostopchin, had threatened as much as the French approached. But it might just as easily have been a consequence of the chaos of war, conceivably down to and including some klutzy French corporal accidentally kicking his camp stove over. History has pivoted on less. With the moral of the story approaching, time to wheel in Tchaikovsky's batteries. Whatever prompted Moscow's incineration, Napoleon was extremely vexed, addressing an abrupt letter to Russia's Emperor Alexander I, in tones suggesting that in our present day and age, Napoleon would have been the terror of TripAdvisor reviews pages.
3/4 of the buildings have been burned. Why destroy one of the most beautiful cities in the world, the work of centuries, for so paltry an end? Such conduct is atrocious, and useless.
It would get swiftly worse for the miffed invader. By the end of 1812, a frozen fraction of the Grand Army would limp back out of Russia. By the spring of 1814, Alexander would lead Russian troops in triumph through Paris, and Napoleon would be en route to his first exile on Elba. Napoleon's march on Moscow endures as a warning against the temptations of hubris and a reminder that all empires overreach eventually. Never has an expansionist power hoisted a final flag on foreign soil and announced, "You know what, lads, this'll do." And the consequences of such misjudgments are usually severe. One or two subsequent occupants of the Kremlin also skipped this lesson. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel Hilton and Vincent McAvaney, also to Nicholas Noe at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.